My boss slid a wrinkled piece of paper across the counter. It had night shift rules scrawled across the top in faded marker. "Read these," he said. "Follow them exactly." I picked up the paper, scanning the list of 6 rules. They made no sense at all. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" I asked. Boss Wilson didn't smile. His weathered face remained completely serious as he adjusted his flannel shirt. "Not a joke, Mitchell. These rules keep you alive during graveyard." I glanced back down at the paper. Rule 1 said to lock the front door at exactly 2:20 a.m. Rule 2 mentioned a man in a red jacket who'd come through the back door. The rest were equally weird. Something about deer at the windows, going to the kitchen during storms, ignoring phone calls after 2:30, and never helping anyone who knocked after 3:00 a.m. "Right," I said, folding the paper and shoving it in my pocket. "Is this how you haze all the new guys?" "This isn't hazing." His voice dropped lower. "Break these rules and you won't make it to morning. That's all I'm saying." He turned and walked to the back office, leaving me alone behind the counter of the Moonlight Diner. I shook my head and grabbed a rag to wipe down the already clean countertop. I needed this job. After 3 months of unemployment, I wasn't about to lose it over some stupid prank. The dinner rush had ended hours ago. Now, at 11 p.m., only a handful of customers remained. A couple of truckers nursing coffee in a booth by the window, and a middle-aged woman picking at a slice of pie. The place looked like any small-town diner stuck in the 1970s. Vinyl booths, checkerboard floor, and a neon sign in the window that buzzed whenever a big truck rolled by on the highway. "You're new," one of the truckers said as I refilled his coffee. "First night," I replied. "Good luck with that," he said, exchanging a look with his buddy that made me uncomfortable. I spent the next hour doing typical diner stuff, washing dishes, restocking napkin dispensers, and brewing fresh coffee. Around midnight, the truckers paid their bill and left. The woman with the pie followed shortly after. A few more people wandered in from the highway. I took their orders, served their food, and made small talk. Nothing unusual happened. The rules in my pocket felt more ridiculous with each passing hour. By 1:30 a.m., the place had emptied out again. I leaned against the counter, scrolling through my phone. The diner sat on a lonely stretch of highway between 2 small towns. Outside the windows, I could see nothing but darkness, occasionally broken by the headlights of passing cars. I pulled out the crumpled rule sheet, reading through it again. What kind of business locks its doors at 2 a.m. when it's supposed to be open 24 hours? And what was all that nonsense about deer and storms? Complete garbage, I muttered, shoving the paper back into my pocket. At 1:45, a group of college kids stumbled in, loud and clearly coming from a party somewhere. They ordered a mountain of food and made a mess of the table. I didn't mind the work. It helped pass the time. I glanced at my watch as I carried plates to their table. 1:58 a.m. The first rule popped into my head. Lock the front door at 2 a.m. exactly. I shrugged. Following one silly rule wouldn't hurt anything. If my boss checked the security cameras later, at least he'd see I was making an effort. At exactly 2 a.m., I walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt. The metal made a satisfying chunk sound as it slid into place. I flipped the sign from open to closed while keeping the lights on, as per the diner's normal procedure for late-night service. We were supposed to stay open for anyone already inside, just not take new customers after 2 a.m. That part, at least, was standard practice, not just some weird rule. The college kids left around 2:10, exiting through the now unlocked door. I locked it again behind them. With their departure, the diner fell into an unnatural quiet. The constant hum of the refrigerators and the occasional tick of the wall clock were the only sounds. No more cars pulled into the parking lot now that the sign showed we were closed. The highway traffic had thinned to almost nothing anyway. I stood in the middle of the empty diner, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. The darkness outside pressed against the windows. "Get it together, Thomas," I said to myself. "It's just a night shift." I grabbed my cleaning supplies and started wiping down the tables the college kids had left sticky with syrup and ketchup. I had the whole place to myself now. No customers, no boss looking over my shoulder. Just me and a list of rules I still didn't believe in. I glanced at the back door, thinking about rule number 2. Something about a man in a red jacket coming through that door. I hadn't locked it yet. "Nah," I said, shaking my head. "One rule is enough to humor the old man." I went back to cleaning, trying to ignore the growing silence and the fact that for the first time since my shift began, I was completely alone in the Moonlight Diner. I had just finished wiping down the last sticky table when I heard it. A soft click from the back of the diner. My head snapped up. It came from the kitchen area, specifically the rear entrance that employees use during the day. The sound was unmistakable, the back door opening. I froze, rag still in hand. My first thought was that Boss Wilson had returned to check on me, but it was too late for that. My second thought was burglary. But who robs a highway diner at 2 a.m? Then I remembered rule 2 on that ridiculous list. Something about a man in a red jacket coming through the back door. The back door I'd completely forgotten to lock. I moved toward the service window between the dining area and kitchen, trying to see who had entered. Through the opening, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone walking with slow, deliberate steps across the kitchen floor. A moment later, he emerged from the kitchen doorway, tall and thin, with an oddly pale face and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a bright red jacket that seemed to stand out unnaturally against the diner's muted colors. My mouth went dry. This matched the second rule exactly. The man didn't look at me. He walked to the counter, pulled out a stool, and sat down. His movements were fluid but strangely mechanical, like each action had been practiced 1,000 times. He placed his hands on the countertop, folded them neatly, and waited. He didn't speak, didn't look at a menu, just sat there, perfectly still. I stood rooted to the spot, clutching my cleaning rag like it might protect me. The whole situation felt wrong. The man hadn't acknowledged me at all, hadn't even glanced in my direction. It was as if he knew exactly what to do, like he'd done this many times before. My mind raced back to the rule sheet in my pocket. What exactly had it said about the man in the red jacket? I pulled it out with shaking hands and read Rule 2 again. At 2:15, a man in a red jacket will come through the back door. Serve him coffee and a turkey sandwich with no questions asked. Always give him extra napkins. Do not attempt conversation. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. I looked back at the man. He continued to sit motionless, waiting. His stillness was unnerving. The rules had seemed like nonsense an hour ago, but now I wasn't so sure. The door had locked at 2 a.m. exactly. The man in the red jacket had appeared right when the rules said he would. Maybe there was something to this after all. I decided not to risk finding out what might happen if I ignored the rules. If this was all some elaborate hazing ritual, the worst that would happen is I'd look stupid serving an unordered meal. If it wasn't, I tucked the rule sheet back into my pocket and walked behind the counter, staying as far from the man as possible while still doing my job. Up close, I noticed how unnaturally pale his skin was. His face had a waxy quality, like a department store mannequin. "Coffee," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. He didn't respond or look up. I poured a cup with trembling hands, nearly spilling it as I set it in front of him. Then I went to the kitchen and prepared a turkey sandwich. Thankfully, we kept pre-made ones in the cooler for late-night orders. I added extra napkins beside the plate, just as the rules specified. When I returned, the man hadn't moved. His coffee remained untouched. I placed the sandwich in front of him and quickly stepped back. Only then did he move. He picked up the sandwich with deliberate care and began to eat. Each bite was methodical, his chewing perfectly timed. He took small sips of coffee between bites. Not once did he look at me or make any indication that he knew I was there. I busied myself cleaning already clean surfaces, keeping one eye on him the entire time. The diner felt colder somehow, the fluorescent lights harsher. The silence was absolute except for the soft sounds of the man eating. After finishing his meal, he reached into his pocket and placed coins on the counter. I stepped closer to see. Exact change for the coffee and sandwich, down to the penny. How did he know the price when he never looked at a menu? The man remained seated at the counter after paying, his empty plate and cup pushed slightly forward. He folded his hands again and resumed his unnervingly still posture. I cleared away his dishes, fighting the urge to ask who he was or what he was doing here. The rules had been specific about not attempting conversation, and I wasn't about to break that directive now. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. 2:30 a.m. A shrill ring cut through the quiet, making me jump. The phone behind the counter was ringing, the old-fashioned landline the diner kept for takeout orders. I automatically reached for it, my customer service training kicking in. My hand stopped inches from the receiver as Rule 5 flashed in my mind. Don't answer any phone calls after 2:30 a.m., no matter how many times it rings. I pulled my hand back like the phone had burned me. The ringing continued, unnaturally loud in the empty diner. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. I counted 10 before it finally stopped. The man in the red jacket didn't react to the ringing. He remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For a few minutes, the diner was quiet again. I began to think maybe the phone call was just a coincidence. Then it started ringing again. This time, I didn't reach for it. I watched it ring, my hands clenched at my sides. Every instinct told me to answer it. What if it was important? What if someone needed help? What if it was my boss checking up on me? But the rule had been clear. No calls after 2:30 a.m. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before stopping again. The silence afterward seemed heavier somehow. 5 minutes later, it rang again, and again after that, and again. Each time, the pattern was the same. 10 rings, then silence, then another call a few minutes later. Each time, I forced myself to ignore it, though it got harder with every call. The ringing seemed to get louder, more insistent. The man in the red jacket never reacted to the phone. He sat motionless at the counter, a strange anchor point in the increasingly surreal night. By 3:30 a.m., I was a nervous wreck. The phone had rung at least a dozen times. My palms were sweaty, and I'd chewed my lower lip raw. Every ring felt like it was drilling directly into my brain. I'd started making up stories about who might be calling: a lost traveler, my sick mother, someone dying on the highway who needed help. But I didn't answer. I couldn't explain why, but the rules felt important now, like breaking them would be much worse than missing a phone call. I stayed behind the counter, keeping my distance from the silent man in the red jacket, and waited for the night to pass, wondering what other rules I'd have to follow before dawn. I stood behind the counter, my nerves frayed from the constant phone calls. The ringing had finally stopped, but the silence felt just as unnerving. The man in the red jacket hadn't moved from his spot at the counter. He sat perfectly still, like a statue someone had placed there as a sick joke. My watch read 2:57 a.m. I'd been on shift for almost 4 hours, but it felt like days. The rules that had seemed so ridiculous at the start of my shift now had me jumping at every sound. The first 2 had proven true, the timing of the door locking and the arrival of the man in the red jacket. I found myself wondering about the others. Rule 3 mentioned something about deer at the windows. I tried to remember the exact wording as I wiped down the counter for probably the 10th time that night. A movement outside caught my eye. I looked up toward the front windows of the diner. My blood turned to ice. A deer stood in the parking lot, illuminated by the diner's neon sign. But instead of running away or grazing on the patchy grass by the highway, it walked with purpose straight toward the building. Its movements were stiff and mechanical, nothing like the graceful creatures I'd seen in the woods back home. It stopped directly in front of the main window and raised its head. Then, in a motion that seemed completely wrong, it pressed its face against the glass and stared directly at me. I remembered Rule 3 now. If deer appear at the windows after 3 a.m., do not look into their eyes or approach the glass. Stay perfectly still until they leave. The deer's eyes looked wrong. I can't explain exactly how, but they weren't animal eyes. They were too aware, too focused. I quickly averted my gaze, looking at the floor instead of meeting its stare. Every instinct told me to move, to back away, to hide, to do something. But the rule said to stay perfectly still. I forced my body to freeze, one hand still on the counter, the other clutching a rag. I could feel sweat beating on my forehead as I kept my eyes down. The seconds dragged into minutes. My muscles started to cramp from holding the same position, but I didn't dare move. From my peripheral vision, I could see the deer was still there, face pressed against the glass, watching. I wondered if the man in the red jacket could see it too. I couldn't turn my head to check his reaction without breaking the rule. After what felt like an eternity, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. The deer had pulled back from the window. It took a few stiff steps backward, still facing the diner, before turning in that same mechanical way and walking into the darkness beyond the parking lot. I waited another full minute before finally allowing myself to breathe normally and relax my frozen posture. My muscles screamed in relief. I looked over at the man in the red jacket. He hadn't reacted at all to the deer. He sat in exactly the same position as before, hands folded neatly on the counter, staring straight ahead. The wall clock read 3:14 a.m. Had the deer really been there for 15 minutes? It had felt both longer and shorter somehow. I pulled out the rule sheet again, hands shaking slightly as I read through the remaining rules. Rule 4 caught my attention. During storms after 3 a.m., stay in the kitchen until it passes. Don't watch the rain. As if on cue, I heard the first soft patter of raindrops hitting the roof. I looked up, then over to the windows. Sure enough, rain had started to fall, light at first, but quickly growing heavier. The timing couldn't be coincidence. First the locked door at exactly 2 a.m., then the man in the red jacket at 2:15, the phone calls after 2:30, the deer at 3 a.m., and now rain after 3 a.m., exactly matching Rule 4. I didn't hesitate this time. The rules had proven themselves too many times now. I quickly walked to the kitchen, positioning myself where I could still see into the dining area through the service window. The man in the red jacket remained visible from my vantage point, still sitting motionless at the counter. The rain intensified, drumming hard against the roof and windows. I had to stop myself from looking directly at the droplets streaming down the kitchen's small window. "Don't watch the rain," the rule had said. I kept my eyes fixed on the dining area instead. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the kitchen in harsh white light. Thunder followed almost immediately, shaking the building. The storm had arrived with unnatural speed. 1 minute light rain, the next a full-blown thunderstorm. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the diner. I jumped as something scraped against the side of the building, probably a branch from the old oak tree that stood near the parking lot. The storm sounds grew louder, more violent. Then I heard it, a loud crash from the dining area, followed by the tinkling of broken glass. I flinched but kept my position in the kitchen, peering cautiously through the service window. A large tree branch had smashed through one of the front windows. Rain and wind now poured into the diner, scattering small shards of glass across the checkerboard floor. Water pooled on the tiles, reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. The man in the red jacket finally moved. He stood up from his stool with the same deliberate movements he'd shown earlier. I watched, frozen in place, as he walked toward the broken window. Glass crunched under his shoes as he approached the jagged opening. The wind whipped his red jacket around him, but he seemed unbothered by the storm raging outside. He stopped directly in front of the broken window, his back to me. For a long moment, he just stood there, facing the darkness and the rain. Then he turned, slowly and deliberately, until he was looking in my direction. For the first time since he'd entered the diner, he acknowledged my existence. He raised one pale hand and motioned for me to come closer, pointing toward the window with his other hand. He wanted me to look at something outside. I stayed rooted in the kitchen doorway, remembering Rule 4, stay in the kitchen during storms. Don't watch the rain. The man beckoned again, more insistently this time. The rules had kept me safe so far. But what did this mean? Was I supposed to go to him? The rule sheet hadn't mentioned what to do if the man in the red jacket tried to communicate. He continued to motion toward the window, clearly wanting me to see whatever was out there in the storm. His face remained expressionless, but there was an urgency to his gestures that hadn't been present before. I gripped the door frame, torn between following the rules that had proven true all night and responding to the first direct communication from this strange, silent man. Through the broken window, the storm raged on, rain lashing inside and soaking the floor around the man's feet. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating something in the parking lot. A shape I couldn't quite make out from my position in the kitchen. The man in the red jacket pointed directly at it, then looked back at me, waiting for my response. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching the man in the red jacket motion toward the broken window. The storm continued to rage outside, rain splashing onto the diner floor. Every rule so far had been proven true, and Rule 4 clearly stated to stay in the kitchen during storms and not watch the rain. I made my decision. I'd move closer, but carefully. I wouldn't break Rule 4 completely. I'd stay well back from the rain and just try to see what he was pointing at. Stepping out of the kitchen, I walked slowly across the dining area, keeping my eyes on the man rather than the storm outside. Glass crunched under my shoes as I approached. The wind had picked up, sending cold air swirling through the broken window and whipping napkins off nearby tables. The man in the red jacket stepped aside as I got closer, making room for me to look out while maintaining a safe distance from the rain. He pointed again, his pale finger directing my attention to the parking lot. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and sheets of rain. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the scene for a brief moment. There was someone standing in the parking lot. A woman with long black hair, completely drenched from the storm. I squinted, trying to see better through the darkness and rain. She was moving toward the diner, her walk strangely determined despite the weather. As she got closer to the building, she stepped into the glow of the neon sign. She looked normal enough, maybe mid-30s, wearing what appeared to be a dark coat over jeans. Her long black hair was plastered to her face from the rain. She looked cold and frightened, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly as if worried something was following her. The woman hurried to the front door and tried the handle. Finding it locked, she began knocking. Forceful, urgent knocks that I could hear even over the storm. She cupped her hands around her face and peered through the glass, clearly looking for someone inside. When she spotted me, her expression changed to relief. She knocked again, more insistently, and mouthed words I couldn't make out. She gestured emphatically, pointing behind her to where I could now see a car parked at an odd angle near the edge of the lot. Even from here, I could tell something was wrong with it. The front end looked damaged. My first instinct was to go let her in. She was clearly in trouble, stranded in a storm with a broken-down car. The decent thing would be to open the door, give her some coffee, and let her use the phone to call for help. I even took a step toward the door before remembering Rule 6. Never help anyone who knocks after 3:00 a.m. I checked my watch. 3:22 a.m. The woman knocked again, harder this time. She looked desperate, her face pressed against the glass as she tried to see inside. She pointed frantically at her car again, then made a phone gesture with her hand, thumb and pinky extended like she was calling someone. As she moved slightly to the side, I noticed something strange. There was an unbroken section of the front window that reflected her image, but what I saw in the reflection didn't match the woman outside. The reflection showed something that only resembled a woman in the loosest sense. The face was decayed, with rotting flesh hanging from exposed bone. Where her eyes should have been were empty, hollow sockets. The mouth in the reflection was too wide, stretched in a grotesque parody of a smile that revealed blackened teeth and a shriveled tongue. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over a chair. The woman outside, the thing outside, continued knocking, its expression still perfectly human and desperate when viewed directly. Only in the reflection could I see its true form. My stomach turned. All the rules were real. Every single one of them was a warning about actual supernatural threats. The locked door at 2 a.m., the man in the red jacket, the deer, the storm, the phone calls. They weren't pranks or hazing. They were survival instructions. I looked back at the man in the red jacket, who had returned to his seat at the counter. He sat with his hands folded, as motionless as before, apparently unconcerned with the monster trying to get into the diner. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The woman, the thing, was now pounding on the glass with both fists. Its human disguise was still perfect when viewed directly, showing an increasingly frightened and desperate expression. It mouthed what looked like "please" and "help me" while pointing at its car. I backed away further, fighting every instinct that told me to help this seemingly stranded woman. My whole life I'd been taught to assist people in trouble. The sight of someone desperate and afraid triggered a deep-rooted response to offer aid. But the reflection had shown me the truth. This wasn't a person at all. The phone behind the counter started ringing again. I jumped at the sudden noise, though I should have expected it by now. The timing made perfect sense. The calls were connected to the thing outside. Another way it was trying to lure me into breaking the rules. I retreated to the kitchen, positioning myself where I could still see into the dining area through the service window. The creature outside moved from the front door to the broken window, peering in through the jagged opening. Rain continued to pour in, forming a puddle that spread across the checkerboard floor. For a moment, I thought it might try to climb through the broken window, but it stopped just short of the opening. Maybe there were rules for these entities too, boundaries they couldn't cross unless invited. The phone kept ringing 10 times before stopping, then starting again a minute later. The knocking continued as well, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the windows. The sound was getting under my skin, making it harder to resist answering. I gripped the edge of the counter in the kitchen, forcing myself to stay put. Every part of me wanted to help what looked like a woman stranded in a storm. Every social norm, every moral teaching screamed that I was doing something wrong by ignoring her. But the rules had been clear, and that reflection had shown me why they existed. Breaking the rules would get me killed. That's what Wilson had warned me about, and now I understood exactly what he meant. I stayed in the kitchen, watching the dining area through the service window while the phone rang and the thing outside knocked and gestured and pleaded silently through the glass. The storm continued to rage, lightning occasionally illuminating the parking lot and the entity that waited there, trying to trick me into opening the door. I gripped the kitchen counter tightly, my knuckles turning white as I watched the creature outside through the service window. The reflection had shown me its true form. Decayed flesh, empty eye sockets, that horrifying stretched mouth. Yet looking at it directly, all I saw was a desperate woman caught in a storm. The rain intensified, turning from a steady downpour into a violent deluge. Water hammered against the roof of the diner with such force that it sounded like someone was throwing handfuls of gravel. Wind howled around the building, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. The creature moved from the broken window to the front door again, its movements becoming more frantic. It pressed its face against the glass, hands cupped around its eyes to see inside. When it spotted me watching from the kitchen, it began knocking with renewed vigor. 3 sharp raps, then 3 more, then a continuous pounding that seemed impossibly loud even over the storm. I stayed put in the kitchen, clutching the rule sheet in my sweaty palm. Rule 4 was clear: stay in the kitchen during storms. Rule 6 was equally clear: never help anyone who knocks after 3 a.m. Breaking either rule now seemed unthinkable after what I'd seen. The phone started ringing again. 10 rings, just like before. Then silence. Then another 10 rings. The pattern continued, but the pauses between calls grew shorter until the ringing became almost continuous, stopping just long enough to make me think it was over before starting again. I paced the kitchen, trying to block out the sound. My head was pounding in rhythm with the knocks and rings. Every instinct screamed at me to answer the phone, to help the woman, to do something other than hide in the kitchen like a coward. Through the service window, I saw the man in the red jacket return to his seat at the counter. He moved with the same mechanical precision as before, as if nothing unusual was happening. He pulled his plate back toward him and continued eating his sandwich, taking small measured bites between sips of coffee. The broken window and the rain pouring in just feet from him didn't seem to register at all. I watched him, baffled by his calm. Glass littered the floor. Rain was forming a growing puddle across the checkered tiles. A monster was trying to break in, and he just sat there, eating. The creature outside moved to a side window, pressing both hands against the glass. Its face took on an expression of pure anguish that looked so genuine, so human, that I almost took a step toward the door before catching myself. "Not real," I whispered, reminding myself of what I'd seen in the reflection. Not human. The phone's ringing changed pitch, becoming more shrill, more urgent. The sound pierced through my skull like a drill. I covered my ears, but it barely helped. The woman, no, the thing, moved to yet another window, leaving smeared handprints on the glass. It tried the handle on the emergency exit door, pulling hard enough that I could see the metal flex slightly. All the while, the man in the red jacket continued eating, unbothered by the chaos. His methodical movements were almost hypnotic. Bite, chew, swallow, sip coffee, repeat. The normalcy of it felt absurd against the backdrop of supernatural horror playing out around us. For nearly an hour, this continued. The storm raged, the phone rang, and the creature tried every possible entrance to the diner. It paced in front of the windows, sometimes disappearing into the darkness only to reappear at another door. Its human disguise never slipped when viewed directly, but I knew what lurked beneath the facade. Every time it appeared at a new window, I'd tense up, worried it would find a way inside. But the locks held. The rules had specified locking the front door at 2 a.m. for a reason. Even the broken window seemed to present some kind of barrier it couldn't or wouldn't cross. Around 4:30, I noticed a change in the storm's intensity. The rain began to slacken, the pounding on the roof becoming less violent. The wind died down from a howl to a whisper. Through the small kitchen window, I could see the first hint of the storm clouds breaking up. The creature noticed too. It stopped its frantic attempts to enter and stood perfectly still in front of the main windows. For a long moment, it just stared inside, its face now expressionless rather than desperate. Then it began to back away. Step by step, it moved backward toward the edge of the parking lot, keeping its eyes fixed on the diner. There was something deeply unnatural about its movement, like watching footage played in reverse. Its feet seemed to slide rather than step, and rainwater ran up rather than down its body. It maintained eye contact with the building until it reached the tree line that bordered the highway. Then, in a motion too quick to follow, it turned and vanished into the darkness between the trees. The moment it disappeared, the phone stopped ringing mid-ring, cutting off with an unnerving abruptness that left a heavy silence in its wake. I held my breath, waiting to see if it would start again. It didn't. I stayed in the kitchen for another 15 minutes, not trusting the sudden quiet. The storm continued to subside, the rain reducing to a gentle patter against the roof. Through the broken window, cool morning air flowed in, displacing the stuffiness that had built up in the diner overnight. Finally, I gathered enough courage to step out of the kitchen. The dining area was a mess. Water covered a good portion of the floor, napkins and menus had been blown off tables, and glass shards glittered everywhere in the harsh fluorescent light. The man in the red jacket had finished his meal. He wiped his mouth with one of the extra napkins I'd given him, then reached into his pocket and placed more coins on the counter. Exact change again. He stood up with that same deliberate movement, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the back of the diner. I stayed frozen in place, watching as he passed through the kitchen without acknowledging me and headed straight for the back door. He opened it with a soft click, stepped outside, and pulled it shut behind him. Just like that, he was gone, as suddenly and strangely as he had arrived. I stood alone in the ruined diner, listening to the fading sounds of the storm and trying to process everything that had happened. The rules had saved my life tonight. Every single one of them had proven true, had protected me from things I couldn't begin to understand. I walked to the back door and made sure it was locked. Through its small window, I could see nothing but the empty parking lot and the highway beyond. No sign of the man in the red jacket. No sign of the creature that had pretended to be a stranded woman. Just the wet asphalt, gleaming under the security lights, and the trees swaying gently in the post-storm breeze. I stood at the back door for a while longer, staring at the wet parking lot through the small window. The last few hours had been a waking nightmare, but I'd survived. The rules had kept me alive, just as Wilson had promised. With the creature gone and the man in the red jacket departed, I turned back to face the disaster area that was now the dining room. Water covered most of the checkered floor, glass from the broken window sparkled under the fluorescent lights, and debris from outside had blown in during the storm. Papers, napkins, and menus lay scattered across the room like confetti after a parade. The work ahead was daunting, but I needed something normal to do with my hands. Something human. I found a mop and bucket in the supply closet and started with the water, working methodically from the counter toward the broken window. Each push of the mop felt grounding, bringing me back to reality after hours of supernatural terror. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see that thing return. The creature with the rotting face reflected in the glass while appearing as a normal woman when viewed directly. But nothing moved outside except the occasional car passing on the highway. The phone stayed silent too. No more calls, trying to lure me into breaking the rules. I emptied the bucket 3 times before getting most of the water off the floor. Next came the glass. Hundreds of tiny shards mixed with larger, jagged pieces. I found a broom and dustpan and began carefully sweeping, making sure to get every piece. The last thing I needed was a customer cutting themselves when the diner reopened later today. The broken window itself presented a bigger problem. I couldn't fix that myself. I found some cardboard boxes in the storage room, broke them down flat, and taped them over the opening as a temporary solution. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the elements out until proper repairs could be made. While taping the cardboard in place, I noticed the first hints of light on the horizon. Not sunshine yet, just a slight lightening of the black sky to deep blue in the east. Dawn was coming. I checked my watch. 5:47 a.m. I'd made it through the night. Moving back to the counter, I pulled out the crumpled rule sheet from my pocket and read through it again. The rules that had seemed so ridiculous hours ago now felt like sacred text. Lock the front door at exactly 2:00 a.m. At 2:15, a man in a red jacket will come through the back door. Serve him coffee and a turkey sandwich with no questions asked. Always give him extra napkins. Do not attempt conversation. If deer appear at windows after 3 a.m., do not look into their eyes or approach the glass. Stay perfectly still until they leave. During storms, after 3 a.m., stay in the kitchen until it passes. Don't watch the rain. Don't answer any phone calls after 2:30 a.m., no matter how many times it rings. Never help anyone who knocks after 3 a.m. 6 simple rules. 6 rules that had saved my life. When Wilson had handed me this paper, I'd thought he was crazy or playing an elaborate joke. I'd been so sure of myself, so confident in my understanding of how the world worked. Now everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. Those deer weren't deer at all. That woman wasn't a woman. The man in the red jacket was something else entirely. And whatever called the diner phone over and over wasn't using a normal telephone. I put the paper back in my pocket and continued cleaning. By the time I'd gotten the place looking somewhat normal again, real daylight had started streaming through the windows. The clock read 6:30 a.m. My shift was technically over. I should have been replaced by the morning crew at 6, but no one had shown up yet. Given what happened during the night, I wasn't surprised they might be running late. I wiped down the counters one last time and took stock of my work. The diner looked decent, considering what it had been through. The broken window was covered, the floor was dry and free of glass, and most things were back in their proper places. A few chairs had been broken in the storm, but otherwise the damage was minimal. What wasn't minimal was the effect the night had on me. I kept jumping at small noises, kept looking over my shoulder expecting to see something unnatural watching me. My hands shook slightly as I put away the cleaning supplies. I knew I would have to come back tonight. I needed this job, that hadn't changed. 3 months of unemployment had left my bank account nearly empty. But more than that, I needed to understand. What was happening here? Why did these things come to the diner at night? What was the man in the red jacket, and why did he show me the true nature of the creature outside? The morning sun had fully cleared the horizon now, washing the parking lot in warm, golden light that made the horrors of the night seem distant and dreamlike. But I knew better. I knew they were real, and I knew they would be back. I leaned against the counter, exhaustion finally hitting me like a truck. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and the adrenaline that had kept me going was draining away. I needed rest before coming back for another shift tonight. The sound of tires on gravel pulled my attention to the window. A car pulled into the parking lot, a beat-up blue sedan I recognized as belonging to Mia, the morning waitress. She parked and got out, looking tired but normal, blissfully, wonderfully normal. I gathered my things, preparing to head out. As I waited for Mia to come in, I made a silent promise to myself. I would follow every rule to the letter tonight. No exceptions, no matter what I saw or heard, no matter how human they looked or how desperately they seemed to need help. Because now I understood the truth that Wilson had tried to tell me. The rules weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were the difference between life and death. The bell over the door jingled as Mia walked in, looking surprised to see me already there. I nodded to her, too tired for conversation, and headed toward the door. The morning air felt fresh and clean after the stuffiness of the diner. Cars drove by on the highway, people heading to work, living their normal lives, completely unaware of what happened in this place after 2 a.m. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and climbed inside. The familiar smell and feel of my own space was comforting. I sat there for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I had survived my first night at the Moonlight Diner, but it was only the beginning.